When I think back on that day, it almost feels like a dream. I mean, it was just a library visit, right? Nothing special. But somehow, what happened there still gives me chills, and even though it's been months. And honestly, I'm still trying to understand if I was just reading too much into things, or if something genuinely wrong was happening that day. It was late December, the kind of cloudy afternoon where the sky looks heavy and the light feels dim, even indoors. I'd been staying with my aunt in this little town in upstate New York while my mom was working out of state. My aunt, you know, she's kind and all, but, well, she's a pretty hardcore reader. The kind that keeps every book she's ever owned, stacks and all. I was starting to feel a little claustrophobic in her house, so I figured, hey, why not go somewhere quiet and read? I'd seen an old library down the street, maybe a 10-minute walk from her place, just sitting there on Fairview Street. It was a little rundown, but seemed charming in its own way, like it had been there forever. I hadn't heard anyone talk about it, which struck me as strange, but then again it was a tiny town. How much foot traffic could an old library get? When I got there, I remember thinking how dark it seemed inside, even though it was still daylight, but I shrugged it off. I walked up the stone steps, pushed open the heavy wooden doors, and stepped in. The scent of dust and paper hit me right away, you know the smell. Old books, polished wood, and that slightly sour scent of paper that's been there too long. I didn't see anyone at first, which felt odd. Usually there's a librarian somewhere, right? I cleared my throat a little and finally saw someone behind the front desk. A woman who looked like she was in her 60s. She had short gray hair and glasses that sat low on her nose. She barely looked up, just mumbled a hello in this half-whispered voice. I figured, hey, maybe she's just the quiet type. I asked her if there was a section with classic novels, and she nodded, pointing toward the back of the library. So I headed that way. As I walked down the narrow aisles, I started to feel odd. I know it sounds strange, but the air felt heavier, like each step was taking me deeper into something. The lighting back there was dimmer than I expected. Only a few bulbs were lit, and even they seemed to flicker occasionally, casting these shaky shadows along the shelves. I finally found the classic novels section and started browsing. I'd barely made it through 2 or 3 titles when I heard footsteps, a soft, uneven shuffle. I looked down the aisle expecting to see someone, but it was empty. I shook it off and kept browsing, chalking it up to my imagination. But then the footsteps came again, and this time they were slower, closer, like someone was walking up behind me. I turned around quickly, but again there was no one, just rows of old books and that dim, flickering light. Starting to feel uneasy, I tried to distract myself by reading the titles in front of me. But then, out of nowhere, I heard a faint whisper, not words exactly, more like the softest murmur. It was coming from the far end of the aisle where the shelves seemed to disappear into the shadows. My heart was starting to race, but I convinced myself it had to be another person. Maybe someone else browsing, someone shy. So I slowly walked toward the sound, peeking down each aisle as I passed, just to see if anyone was there. Finally, I reached the end of the row, and there was a man standing there. He looked to be in his 50s, wearing a plain dark coat and a flat cap pulled low over his eyes. He had this old leather-bound book in his hands, and he seemed completely focused on it, like he hadn't noticed me. His face was pale, almost colorless in the dim light. I took a deep breath and said, "Excuse me," just to be polite. But he didn't look up, didn't even flinch, just kept staring at the book, his fingers tracing the edge of the pages. It was like he was in some kind of trance. I thought about saying something again, but felt awkward. Something about him seemed so off, so I just quietly backed away, leaving him there. But as I turned to leave, I swear I heard him whisper something. It was so faint I almost missed it, but it sounded like, "She's here." I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned back, half expecting him to be looking at me, but he was still standing there, eyes glued to the book. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. At that point, I decided to leave. As I walked back toward the front, the library felt different. It was like the air had grown colder, and every little sound, the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of paper, felt amplified. When I reached the front desk, the older librarian was gone. I figured she'd gone on a break, but for some reason it made me uneasy. It was strange, being alone in this big, silent building. I took one last look around and started for the door. But just as I reached it, I heard the footsteps again, slow, deliberate, right behind me. I turned around, my heart pounding, and there he was, the man from the back aisle. He was standing maybe 15 feet away, staring right at me, his face blank, his eyes empty. We just stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. My mouth went dry. I opened my mouth to ask him if he needed help, if he was lost or something, but no words came out. Then slowly he raised his hand, pointing a single finger at me and whispered, "Don't come back." His voice was so low, so cold, like he was saying it more to himself than to me. And then, just as quickly as he'd appeared, he turned and walked back into the darkness of the library, disappearing between the shelves. I didn't wait to find out what he meant. I bolted out of there, practically running down the steps and out into the open air. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was halfway down the street. When I got back to my aunt's place, I told her what had happened. She looked at me with this strange expression and said, "You went to the library on Fairview? It's been closed for months. They shut it down for renovations." I felt my blood turn to ice. Closed? But I'd just been there. I'd talked to the librarian, seen the man with the book. I insisted that it couldn't be true, that I'd just come from there. But when we walked back down the street together, the doors were locked, the lights were off, the windows were covered with dust. It was like no one had been there in ages. I don't know what I saw that day, or who I spoke to. And to be honest, I don't want to know. All I know is that every time I walk past that building, I can feel something watching me. And I can still hear his words echoing in my mind. Don't come back.